On the second day of the COP27 climate summit, the focus has been on how developing and small island nations are coping with the impact of climate change. The Prime Minister of Pakistan recounted how his nation had suffered from extreme floods and made a plea for richer nations to help. Joining me now is the Vice President of International Strategies at the Centre for Climate and Energy Solutions, Kaveh Guilanpour, who is in Sharm el-Sheikh. Thank you very much. And the UN saying basically that national plans in countries responsible for most emissions have no credible pathway, the words were, to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. How can COP27 change that, do you think?
Well, thanks for inviting me, Mark. I think that's a very important message from the UN Secretary General that we are definitely not on track for staying within the 1.5 degree Celsius temperature limit of the Paris Agreement.
Kaveh
has shown that very clearly. But on the positive side, what is good in terms of the trajectory is that every year with each successive COP, the trajectory is in the right direction. So at the Paris COP, we were heading for a world that was well over 3 degrees of temperature rise. Now we're below that and we're closer to 2. But certainly we will need to do more. And there's still time left at this COP to try to get parties and countries and businesses around the world on the right pathway. But we are definitely on track, definitely not on track at this moment in time.
No. Kaveh, how do you build accountability into this? Now, I know that in Paris, or the Paris targets are legally binding, but, you know, they're not being met. How can countries be held to account more efficiently?
Well, you're right. The Paris Agreement often is characterized as being voluntary, but it is a treaty and it is binding in international law. And it has a very clear legally binding requirement for countries to come forward with domestic legislation and plans to try to meet their targets. And some countries have done that. The UK has come forward with robust legislation towards net zero. It's starting to put in place the policies to implement that. The European Union, the United States has come forward with domestic legislation. It's not enough, but it's a step in the right direction. So the Paris Agreement does have what is called an enhanced transparency framework to try to monitor where parties are against their commitments. And when that kicks in, at the moment, it's going to show we're off track. But what's interesting is that today the UN Secretary General released a report that also called on accountability for the private sector and other entities below the national level who are making pledges for net zero left, right and centre, but we really need to know whether they are serious and whether they are delivering against robust commitments.
Yeah, but I guess governments are the real issue here. I just wonder, where is the body to enforce these commitments, these agreements, and making sure targets are met? Because without that, I suppose things are going to be, you know, just go from COP to COP, and it may be on the right trajectory, but do you get there?
Yes, again, I mean, you're right. Essentially, the Paris Agreement was built around a framework of requiring countries to progressively ratchet up their ambition every 5 years. And we're actually halfway through that first ambition cycle of the Paris Agreement. So we'll find out next year at COP28 what the recommendations are there for the next round of targets. But coupled with those commitments is a system to hold countries accountable against what they've promised. But essentially that depends on peer review and frankly, embarrassment in the sort of court of public opinion if a country doesn't meet what it's promised to do. So there's no enforcement mechanism as such. There's no penalties under the Paris Agreement. But of course, there's increasing political pressure and pressure from countries and vulnerable people and civil society around the world to meet those promises that have been kept.
Now, there's clearly a moral argument for, you know, loss and damage, reparations, and so forth. What is the chance, do you think, of a consensus on that? Because, you know, a lot of countries don't seem to be willing to stump up the billions, or it's probably trillions that are required. And just a question, isn't the whole loss and damage argument a problem in that it could deflect from the main point that you're trying to get across, which is, you know, sort of adaptation going forward?
Yes, again, a very good point. It was certainly lined up to be the most contentious issue here at COP27, but the incoming presidency, now the COP presidency of Egypt, had done a lot of work reaching out to countries in the months and weeks before COP27. And actually, the COP started positively with the agreement of an agenda item on loss and damage. So that the first hurdle has been passed. The real test will be, what does that agenda item result in the future? And the debate and the door is still open as to that. Certainly, there's a very clear understanding that countries will need more money to deal with the impacts of climate change, including those that can't be adapted to, the losses and damages. But the real question is, what will that look like? And as you say, the impacts are severe, they're very visible, and they're only going to get worse, even if we stay within the limits of the Paris Agreement. So this issue is only going to get more important and more fraught, frankly, as we see the impacts getting worse. Thank you, Mark.